So first question is, in what ways can Moses Mendelssohn be considered the father of the Haskalah, father of enlightenment? Well, in some ways, his example, right? He was well-versed in both non-Jewish intellectual pursuits and Jewish traditional learning. He created a philosophical defense of a distinct Jewish presence integrated into European society. One other thing that he did, I forgot to mention earlier on, is that he translated the Bible into German written in Hebrew letters. Now, what would be the goal of that? It was to teach the Jews who were speaking Western Yiddish standard German, because they already knew the Hebrew alphabet and they already knew Yiddish. But if you teach them the standard German by doing a translation of the Bible into German and Hebrew letters, they can then use that as a bridge to European languages. And once you know the languages, you can read the philosophy, the ideas, and participate in the broader European culture. Now, again, some would argue that Mendelssohn's children converting to Christianity is one of the dangers of Haskalah and Enlightenment, and that way he might also be considered the father of the Haskalah. You know, most famously, his grandson, you might have heard of, named Felix Mendelssohn, right? Wedding March, etc. That's a child of one of his converted children. So Felix Mendelssohn of Jewish ancestry, but not raised Jewish. Okay, number 2. How are the programs of Haskalah and early Reform Judaism similar to secular humanistic Judaism, and how are they different? So what are some of the similarities of Haskalah and early Reform, and then we'll talk about the differences separate.
You mentioned that they, the men and women could sit together as a family. Trying to think what else.
Sit in pews, not in circles around
the
sit in,
right.
They wanted order and rows and formality, what they would call decorum. That was the phrase they used.
Well, there's a larger emphasis on secularism. I mean, the religious aspects are still important, but so are the secular aspects that identify you with the rest of the people who are not Jews in your culture.
Right. So you're interested both in intellectual things like, excuse me, like philosophy, current ideas, and also cultural things, and the way you dress, what foods you eat, the cultural events you participate in, your status as a citizen. These are all things that become more important, what we might call this worldly or more secular concerns. Ren, you were going to add something?
I was going to say slightly less sexist in terms of congregational thing. You get confirmation instead of just the public or mitzvah. You have women singing in, of course, up for people rather than just the male doing the niguns and everything. You have the not segregating of the sexes, so you have a little bit more gender equality, at least in a congregational setting.
Right. And even an emphasis on girls' education. The Orthodox girls' schools that we think of today, the Beis Yaakov schools is a famous example. Those started in the 1920s. But the Reformed Jewish world is educating Jewish girls in the 1810s and 20s. So they're really ahead of the curve on that front. It's still horrifically late in human culture, but it's ahead of the curve. Their willingness to change ritual practices, to change the liturgy, even if it's just editing it out or providing a translation into a language people actually understand. That's the idea that you should understand what you're saying is an important value that we share. And also the concept that you need a reason for your observance. And if the observance doesn't make sense, or you disagree with the reason behind it, then maybe you can change it. It might take time to change it. You might want to change slowly, depending on if you're reform or conservative. But the idea that you have to have a reason to keep it, or a reason to keep it the same, or a reason to change it, that's using reason to affect what your practice is. Whereas the apologetics of Moses Maimonides in the 1200s or Moses Mendelssohn in the 1700s were trying to defend keeping the traditional practice as opposed to allowing reason and argument to affect and change the traditional practice. That's more like us, more like the Haskalah, and more like Reform Judaism. Now, what are some differences between that 19th century and late 18th century Haskalah reform and how we do secular humanistic Judaism today? What are some of the differences?
Belief in God.
So for them, Judaism was a religion. It was often called, I'm a German of the Mosaic faith. So the focus was on Judaism as a religion, not as a people. Whereas for us, that cultural, ethnic sense of a family, however you define it, is a core part of how we do our Jewishness. Other differences?
Well, I mean, we certainly have more gender equality.
Yeah, we're much further along in that direction.
Yes, and I would say that, I mean, much more modern in sort of human rights than, but that I think a lot of that has to do with the age. I mean, I don't think they were doing a lot of same-sex weddings back then, or probably interfaith weddings, you know?
Right.
So
Although they were willing to debate some radical things. Some were actually open to, dialogues with other religions, even to the point of affirming interfaith marriage. And they debated whether or not they should keep circumcising men. I mean, that was an open debate in the 1840s and 50s, because some thought it was barbaric and primitive, and others said, how dare you challenge this core sign of our faith? There were some boundaries they weren't willing to cross in that period. And again, some of that's a function of the surrounding age and development, and some of that was still a reluctance to go too far. And they still kept the idea of being a chosen people of some kind, but for them it was a mission to spread monotheism. They were sort of the original monotheists, and this idea of ethical monotheism as the core of Judaism was a reform idea as a way to keep people Jewish, but in a way that would fit with the nationalism of the time. Your nationality could not be Jewish. It had to be French. Your religion could be Jewish, and that was how you could fit it in. Okay, and number 3, in the questions Napoleon posed, well, we discussed this at some length, what his major concerns were. In the answers they gave, do any of them vary from or even cleverly avoid traditional Jewish answers, and why do you think? Well, I think, again, we talked about this in some detail. Part of the payoff was full emancipation. And the Assembly of Notables knew, they were smart. They knew what Napoleon wanted to hear, and they wanted to be French citizens. So they decided it was worth hiding traditional answers or changing them to the questions. And don't forget, this was an assembly not only of rabbis. It's sometimes called the Paris Sanhedrin, but a Sanhedrin is an assembly of rabbis only. This was rabbis and lay leaders. And it may well have been that some of the lay leaders who were there were already open to some of these changes that were taking place, more so than the rabbis were. Notice in one of those answers, it said, the opinion of the rabbis is opposed to this. Didn't necessarily mean that everybody there was fully on board with banning intermarriage the way the rabbis were interested in doing.
I have a question, and maybe it's for taking us off on a different tangent for now, but what was Napoleon's aha moment? Why did he care so much? That's where it's not gotten, I've not gotten that figured out.
Right.
I know my history well enough to know that.
Right. To be honest, I'm not positive if there was one trigger for this. I think it was the ongoing debates over Jewish emancipation. They had debated it in the 1790s with the first round of emancipating the Jews of Bordeaux, who were a little more integrated into French culture. Then in 1793 or 95, they emancipated the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine. Now Napoleon's beginning to conquer Europe and expand the number of Jews he's controlling, particularly in Germany and in parts of Italy. And so it's become a more pressing question of how to handle this population from all these different countries that are maintaining some sense of an identity that isn't just their national identity.
Well,
And the other piece that becomes an interesting challenge for Enlightenment thought. Remember, Enlightenment is a kind of universalist ideal, right? Everybody has a blank canvas, a pure rational mind, and so on. And the irony is that nationalism persists despite this idealism, this universalism of the Enlightenment. In theory, it shouldn't matter if you were German or French or Italian. You are part of the Enlightenment government system now. But what wound up happening was the nationalists got really upset that the French beat the Germans and the Russians fought back. I mean, Tchaikovsky was a universalist until Napoleon invaded Russia. And then he wrote the 1812 Overture celebrating the defeat of Napoleon because, you know, Enlightenment ideals work great until they invade your country. So the Jews were this perennial challenge to Enlightenment because they insisted on being different and not just becoming universalist citizens of the world. And they've persisted in this role, so much so that you occasionally get people blaming the Jews for all the ills, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about 19th century anti-Semitism, because the Jews are sometimes seen as what are called rootless cosmopolitans. They're too internationalist. They're too much part of this Enlightenment universalism that undermines true nationalism. But sometimes the Jews are accused of being inveterate tribalists who are only interested in what's good for them. And that's the critique the Enlightenment might offer against the Jews. You can read things that Voltaire wrote. Voltaire is one of the major thinkers of the Enlightenment. He wrote some terribly anti-Jewish material because they were emblematic of this tribalism. And for a secular Enlightenment thinker, he actually blames the Catholic Church on the Jews because they started this whole religion thing in the first place.
Can I add a little context to that also?
Sure, please.
The thing to remember about Napoleon is that the Jews were only one smallish part of a larger kind of effort that he was making. Everywhere that Napoleon conquered, he introduced French laws. He introduced French culture. He didn't expect Germans to become Frenchmen, but even like Holland was renamed, a different name. I'm forgetting it right now. But when he went into Russia, for example, and he came across Jews there, they didn't have last names. They were, Moshe bin Yatzik, Yitzhak, and he made them take last names. And but he did that everywhere. I mean, wherever he went in, like when in Egypt, he introduced, French laws and stuff and tried to like make the Egyptians, the Muslims, do French laws because he felt that French law and culture was the best. And so everywhere he went, he tried to introduce these things. So in Germany, for example, he did away with a lot of the medieval laws that still existed, guild laws and stuff. So it was a whole big reform effort, much bigger than really he contemplated, I think, that when he started it. But the Jews were part of that. And they were like this, like you say, they were sort of this indigestible medieval element somehow that were sort of tribal, and he needed to deal with that and see, well, can you be like everybody else that I foresee as members of a French Europe, because he didn't foresee him losing down the line. So what I'm saying is that take it in the larger context. What he's asking the Sanhedrin is similar to what he's doing in other places, especially in the lowlands and in Germany, in trying to adjust and do away with all these medieval remnants that are pre-Enlightenment.
Right, exactly. Thank you. Okay, our next question. What were some of the major changes in Jewish economic and social life as a result of emancipation? We didn't really talk about this directly, but sort of speculate. Once Jews are able to become citizens, what might be some of the changes that would affect themselves on Jewish communities in terms of both economic factors and also social factors?
I mean, you mentioned that they have any kind of job. They could have governmental jobs. They could. They no longer had to be in a closed community. They could, potentially move or live in other locations.
Mm-hmm. Just think, a world before Jews going to college. Mm-hmm. Remember, the universities were often run by the Catholic Church. It was very rare for Jews to go, and often they would only study in the medical faculty because everything else, law was canon law, it was church law. But now Jews can go to university and study history. They can study literature. Again, at a later period, they might even be able to become professors in academia. They can work for the government. Any profession is open to them. Any residence is open to them. What are some other changes that might take place, maybe internally in Jewish society?
Well, when you break apart, when you allow the community to emigrate to places they weren't allowed to go before, when you allow them to go into professions, they may move them around. They integrate into society, which means that they may cease to be part of a larger Jewish community. You may lose members by doing that, and you sort of dilute. When the ghetto collapses and people start moving into neighborhoods that weren't Jewish, you start to dilute the culture. It becomes harder. You know, maybe you're in a small village somewhere as a doctor now, and there's no synagogue, you know, because there isn't a big enough community to have a synagogue. So now what happens to your Jewishness at that point?
Right. So it both affects the community cohesion, but it also might affect your personal practice. Like, for example, in many towns into the 20th century, you were not allowed to have your business open on Sunday. That was the general law. Well, if you're a Jew who closes their business early on Friday and is closed on Saturday, and then is also closed on Sunday, you're at a real disadvantage to your competitors who are open all day on Saturday. And so maybe you somehow find a way to all of a sudden decide that you're allowed to work in your business on Saturday.
Or you hire a nice Christian boy to handle it on Saturday.
Well, or you find some compromise that before you wouldn't have found.
Right.
Of course, then this nice Christian boy starts spending time with your daughter, and then who knows, you know, so then things go downhill from there. Okay. So the reality is that these new circumstances of living, working, participating in general culture, you could go to the opera, you can participate in the symphony and enjoy it and even contribute to it. That begins to influence your Jewish practice too. You know, people sometimes don't put the dots together. They see all these changes that Reform Jews started making of sitting in pews and putting in pipe organs and choirs. How did they know what was going on in the churches? Maybe they went. Or they sat outside. I mean, there's obviously some kind of communication going on here of what's going on in there that they then import into Jewish life. So there's a lot more interaction than we might have imagined even before the changes happen, so they know what the changes might be. And, you know, when you have social contact with non-Jews or professional business contact with them, you might decrease your separationist behavior, your dress, your diet, your language, and all kinds of other impacts might be felt.
Can I also just add that,
Sure.
Remember that the same Enlightenment issues are happening to the Christian communities. So they too are also, so I mean, there's a divide happening between the intellectual Enlightenment, you know, leaders, which many Jews want to interact with, and who are no longer going to church, or no longer, you know, traditional Catholics or Protestants, you know, who have their deists, they have doubts. I mean, look at many of the founders of the American Revolution, for example, who are clearly not traditional Christians in any sense.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Yep. And, you know, at the same time, they're grappling with those issues. There's also a sort of traditionalist response and reaction against the Enlightenment. It's called the Romantic movement, that will reject a lot of those premises and reaffirm a kind of ethnic nationalism that in many instances excludes the Jews as a foreign body. And again, we'll learn more about that when we talk about anti-Semitism. I wanted to mention one last detail when Lori mentioned that Enlightenment could be bad for Jewish community. There's a famous anecdote, it's probably not true, but worth sharing anyways, that when Napoleon's armies began to sweep into Russia and other countries of Eastern Europe, as we understand them today, an early Lubavitcher rabbi was asked, like the head of the sect, the Rebbe, was asked, for whom should we pray for victory, for the Tsar or for Napoleon? And the Rebbe said, we should pray for the Tsar. Pray for the Tsar with all the suffering and disasters he's put on us. And the Rebbe's answer was, well, if Napoleon wins, it will be good for Jews, but bad for Judaism. That is, individual Jews will be free, but it will be bad for Jewish cohesiveness. Whereas if the Tsar wins, it might be bad for Jews, but it'll be good for Judaism. That the outside pressure and persecution will keep people united and connected to each other, if for nothing else, because they won't be allowed to leave. So our last question, why did the Haskalah succeed in Western Europe, but was not as successful in Eastern Europe?
I mean, you just mentioned, you know, I mean, the Tsar, you know, pretty much kind of put a kibosh on all of that and wanted to continue to keep them in completely separate, unequal status, whereas obviously this Enlightenment was going on in Western Europe, and the Jews were becoming more assimilated into the communities.
Right, right. Also, remember the Russian economy was pretty much a feudal economy. And I mean feudal in both feudal and futile, like it was not very well put together. But I mean, they just emancipated the serfs in, I think, 1863. I mean, this is a backward economy for where things are in Europe. And so it's just not conducive to social change. And the non-Jewish intellectual developments in some cases were much more closed, as what was happening in Russian Orthodoxy or pan-Slavic thought that, again, would exclude the Jews from being part of a pan-Slavic Renaissance. Whereas in Western Europe, there was some democracy and some willingness to open up doors. And as we'll see in a future class, the modern capitalist economy enabled some Jewish social climbing or changing professions. And in the end, the context of Enlightenment, for all of its flaws and limitations, was an opening of doors to Jews to participate in European culture without having to get the passport that Heine did by converting out of Jewish identity. So any last thoughts, comments, or questions?
Well, the more successful the Enlightenment was in penetrating a society, the more successful Haskalah was going to be in penetrating the Jewish community in that society. The less successful, as for example, in authoritarian Russia under the Tsar, or in Poland and places like that, the less you're going to have that be successful, because the two kind of went hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, the payoff was obvious, right? If you have the opportunity to be economically successful by joining the surrounding culture, there's a payoff there. So you want your kids to be fluent in German or fluent in French and participate in the secular school system and so on. Where in a setting where that's not the case, it's a much harder sell. There were still maskilim, enlighteners, that tried to make changes of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, but it was a much harder sell given the context was much less inclusive and welcoming.